Welcome everybody to this session on why to publish or how to publish books in comparative politics. My name is Nicole Bolleyer. I'm at LMU Munich, and I'm very happy to have a very distinguished panel here with experiences both as book authors, but also as editors for different publishers. That was actually an idea by Susan Scarrow, University of Houston. When the ECPR asked me, do you want to do some session on publishing books? We had run for the OUP Comparative Politics series an event in Innsbruck, which was very well attended. And then Susan said, why do we not try to get together people with editorial experience from different presses? Because that is even more useful than just trying to advertise our own series. So we have Susan here, who was my series editor at the OUP Comparative Politics series, my predecessor, essentially. We have here Thomas Poguntke, University of Düsseldorf, and who has editorial experience with ECPR Press. And then we have Arjan Schakel, University of Bergen, for Palgrave. And as I say, we have no presentations, but we have thought what would be useful to do in terms of the basic structure we want to have of our discussion. And so the idea was just to go once around and talk about what are basically people talk a little bit about their experiences as authors, editors, but talking more broadly about the challenges and the benefits of writing books. And then to move more specifically in a second round to the practicalities of which might be interesting for those of you who have an idea for a book or maybe a manuscript lying around that you want to do something with, to talk more about the specific processes of getting from an idea or some draft to a contract to publishing with the individual presses, because the confusing thing is a bit that, of course, the standards or the expectations, how much material do you need at the point of approaching someone, differs by press. And so we thought the second round would be a more specific and a bit more practically orientated. But I think it's also, obviously, we are all used to academic life, and it's very difficult getting all things done that we have to do. So sustaining the energy writing a book-length manuscript is increasingly challenging, but we still think we should try to convince the audience it's a worthwhile thing to do. And I pass on to Susan as the first one to maybe pitch in with her experiences and advice.
Okay, let me start. Thank you, Nicole. Let me start. Let's get a sense of our audience here. How many of you are doctoral students? Okay, how many are postdoctoral? Okay, a lot of that. And how many have already published one book and you're thinking about your second book? Okay, few of you. Okay, so we've got a range here. So our advice will be different for different career stages. My thought, or a couple thoughts on this. One is there are still presses. So just like there are still universities, it was hard to get into a university program. And on one side, you think there's so much demand for these slots and these postdocs, and I'll never get them. On the other hand, you have presses or universities who need to hire postdocs and need to publish books. So you have to think about it from both sides, not only why you want it, or it might be good for your career, but also think about why are presses still publishing books? And that'll help you, which is a little different than why is your PhD supervisor going to read this? And that is one of the big differences between the dissertation and the book, that nobody has to read your book, but your dissertation supervisor has to read your PhD. So that's a big start. So let me just two thoughts that I'm going to, thinking about the why and think about the so what. The why depends where you want to get a job next. So mostly, for most of you, the question is publishing a book good for my next step in my career? And that depends. We can't give you an answer on that because different national systems differ, different universities differ. Our discipline now is a hybrid discipline. Some people publish books. Some people publish journal articles only. many people do both at some stage in their career. But you have to think about, you're not, perhaps 40 years ago, it would have been a no-brainer. I have to publish my dissertation as a book. That is not so anymore. And there are some real advantages to not publishing the book right away, such as speed. You can get a journal article out faster than you can get a whole book out. Now, it's not either or. Many people get a book and they also publish a journal article from their dissertation. But that's what you need to be thinking about. Then the second question you need to answer when you're thinking about a book manuscript is, so what? Right? What is my why should anyone want to read this? What's my message? Who's my audience? Who wants to do this? And as editors, when we get book prospectuses, one of the things we've done, at least at the OUP ECPR series, is we try to coach people on how to make a good push, a good sell to the Oxford editor. And often what we're doing is telling people, this is way too academic, this is way too long. You forget to say in the first paragraph, why should anyone read this book? So a lot of what we're doing is that as academics, after you've been working on a project forever, you forget to answer the so what question. So so why do you want to do it? So what? Why should anybody else want to read it?
Thank you. Welcome. I knew this would happen, so Susan has stolen some of my thunder, but that's fine. That's great. Let me add a few things. We can probably come back to the question, whether or not you need this in some systems and not in others. We leave this to the discussion. I think generally, this thing about whether you should do journal articles or books, there's a bit of a structural thing. It's a bit short-term versus long-term. In a way, articles tend to be out faster if you're lucky. They tend to also disappear faster. If a book is good, it stays there for much longer. So it is visible quite for a long time. The second general point you need to think about is, where do you want to get published? And I'll come back to this in a minute. There are university presses, there are other presses which are easier to get. There are certainly also some publishers out there which you shouldn't do. I think in English they're called convenience presses or something like that. You pay for them, so don't do that. Obviously, that's perfectly obvious. And also, I think a book has certain advantages. First of all, you have the chance to also report things that usually get edited out, or you cannot get them past reviewers. You can be a bit more descriptive. You can have develop longer theoretical arguments, etc. So I think there are a lot of substantive reasons for doing books. I quite like books. Secondly, it's also a good way of profile building. We are moving in the direction that depends on which sort of subcategory of social sciences you look at. We're moving into this direction of multi-author journal articles. And sometimes when I sit on selection committees, you look at these CVs and you don't know. So what's actually the profile of that particular applicant? What is his or her real thing, because there are always 5, 6, 7 names on the title. So that is, and of course, the question whether you should do it or not has a lot to do with the question, where do you want to have your next job? So we can come back to this later. I've already mentioned that it goes without saying that the quality of the publisher is important, but it's not the only thing. We are increasingly, no, I wanted to say one little thing about chapters in edited volumes, because this is also something that comes up. You may have a good conference paper and somebody knocks virtually at your door and say, can we do an edited volume? And then the question is, do I turn down this offer and turn this into a journal article, or do I go along with an edited volume? And I would say it depends. It depends a lot on the coherence of this planned volume. It also depends on which publisher you're going to get, because if it's an incoherent volume with a second-rate publisher, it's a second-rate burial for that chapter, and you're much better advised to go for a journal article. So there's no straightforward advice. Last point I want to make, there's an increasing, everything is moving. I mean, especially now that also large publishers, established university presses are moving towards open access. That also means that in a way, the distinction between journal articles and book chapters, also chapters in edited volumes, is probably going to fade away a little bit, you know, because if you do a chapter in a good edited volume with a good university press and it's open access, it's, you know, it's there, it's visible, and that's at the end of the day what you want. You want to be read, you know, and ideally be cited, you know. So publishers are going increasingly towards open access. And I think this is also a question when you choose a publisher for a monograph, you know, is it a press? You know, I sometimes advise people not to try the hard to get university presses and go for something a little bit lower, like Springer. They do a lot of open access, you know. So there can be a consideration. It's probably debatable, but I leave it at that.
Yeah, then I have the difficult task to even add more insights, which I probably can't, but I can underline some of the things that have been previously said. There are actually many of the things you've mentioned about what you can do in a book. There are also alternative ways to do that, actually. For example, you would like to provide a bit more detail about the conceptualization and operationalization of your dependent or independent variables. You can add an appendix to a journal article. And if the journal doesn't provide space for appendices online, you can publish them on your own website or your institutional website. But this underlines one of the other points you both have made, you know, what are the reasons for writing a book? And it can be these external factors, job market, and it can be these intrinsic motivations. And they can coincide or they can be counterproductive a bit. But one thing I think is for sure, a book project is a long-term project. And you need a lot of stamina to go through it. So better make sure that whatever the external factors are, there's enough intrinsic motivation for you to embark on that path. And then just another thing that I cannot almost stress enough. A book is kind of 1 + 1 is 3. I don't know how else to summarize it in a nutshell. So what is the added value, right? Okay, profile building, right? Who am I as a researcher? We have now many PhD theses consisting of whereby the different chapters are actually different articles. And then often there's an introduction or concluding chapter that actually needs to do exactly that. But how are these different, what is the red thread throughout these different pieces of research, even if they are multi-authored? And that's then you as the researcher and the contribution that you have made. So what then in the end is the added value of the book? Not only for yourself in terms of who am I as a researcher, what kind of theory argument would I like to pose? What kind of conclusion would I like to pose or introduce into the community? And why? And then the external part comes in. How do I sell it, basically? How do I convince the readers that this is an important contribution, something important that I have to tell, right? And that's in the end what you also need to, what you said in the first paragraph, the so what, right? So.
Can I stop? And I want to do another audience survey.
Okay.
Following up on something Thomas said. How many of you have gone to a library, a physical library, in the past 60 days? Well, it's pretty good. Because publishers are increasingly thinking that you're not going to check out a book. They're not buying books. They're thinking they are putting their collections online, and they're thinking, and then the libraries subscribe. You go to your library online portal and you check out a chapter or you check out a book electronically that way. And so a lot of what is called a book now is an electronic book or a publish on demand book. because publishing is so expensive. The books we're talking about are so expensive, only libraries are going to buy them. But the library will subscribe to all the Palgrave books, or it'll subscribe to all the ECPR books, and then you have access to them, to their whole collection, and then they pay per use. But so that's what's in it for the publishers nowadays as we consume these differently. But again, as Thomas said, the great thing about that is many more people have access to your books and can cite them than used to be the case when they were only available in 200 libraries. Now they're available in 2,000 libraries and can be downloaded that way. And so they're much more accessible. So this, for you as a potential publisher, that's a really good thing.
Maybe to add or pick up on a few issues that I had on my list, but were obviously already touched upon. I think one important point that Arjan made is, and we might want to come back to that, there are tensions between, as you said, intrinsic motivation to do it, and why would one bother for oneself as an academic to go into that long-term project, and also how to manage the long and the short-term pressure. And one thing I want to pick up on, which also links back to the tendency that by now, when books are published electronically, also the publishers often expect that if somebody downloads chapter 5, you can understand chapter 5 as a freestanding kind of piece, while of course that is sort of in tension with the actual reason to write a book in the first place, that you have maybe explored different aspects of a broader phenomenon, and you have published a few articles with a relatively specific dependent variable, and you back everything nicely up methodologically and so forth to get it through the process. And then there is a point, and that's, I think, to me, an important intrinsic motivation, where you think, but there are these interconnections between these bits that I explore, and I only can spell them out and develop them and link them with the space I have in a book to the literature in such a way that I can highlight these interconnections. So I think there is a certain tension also there. But I think to me, it seems that is, and as Arjan stressed, it makes it worthwhile, because I think also sometimes what we get as prospectors is you sort of see that several chapters on the same phenomenon, but there is not a very strong integration between it. And then I get always the question always being, so why don't you just publish this as 5 freestanding pieces? This kind of the interconnection and the integration is actually the main reason for me to write it. But I also think it's probably the main reason why a reader would go to the library and check out the whole book and then go through it from start to finish, rather than saying, I'm interested in this aspect of the phenomenon. Chapter 7 is dealing with, read chapter 7, move on. Like they actually read also articles. So in that sense, I think also the point Susan made, to always think about what actually what do I get out of it intellectually, and what does the reader get as a value added to read a whole monograph, rather than just sticking with articles. And I think that can be an important motivation. But I think what would be interesting maybe is, we have seen that many people in the audience, thanks to Susan's survey, who are sort of thinking about writing a book. Is there any advice to give about how to maneuver these kind of obvious tensions between short-term and long-term benefit you might have, rather publishing through articles or taking actually the time to do the overall project? Do you have any advice to give? I guess here, and that's something Thomas mentioned, the question is central: what career stage you are on. And on the one hand, one might say, well, and that's the impression I have, I was very stressed during my PhD, and now I sometimes look back and I wonder, what on earth did I do this for 4 years? Because of course you are much, that's the period where you actually can, in a sustained fashion, think about one thing, which I hardly ever can do anymore. So it seems that the PhD is an excellent basis to start out thinking, if it's not a cumulative PhD, that's only articles anyway, to write a book. But on the other hand, once you are on a permanent job, you can say, I want to write this book, and if I'm not happy with whatever I produce in 4 years, then, well, then it takes 6 who cares, and then I'm done and I'm really happy with it. That is, of course, something somebody who's on a postdoc that might be a few years, such a luxury you do not have. So I'm really wondering whether you have any advice on how to manage these tensions.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a difficult question to answer in general or answer from my own perspective and my own experience. Because when I did my PhD, I could choose either between articles or a book manuscript or a monograph. And I choose articles because basically I want to get a job afterwards, right? Or yeah, that was mainly external motivations that drove that. Nevertheless, I think we all at one stage in our career want to make a statement or want to, you know, have something that tells, this is me as a researcher, and this is what I have to tell. But so that comes sooner or later. And then, yeah, I don't know. It's it comes natural in a way, or in one way it comes at your path. And how far can you plan it? But you need to have a clear idea. If you don't have the idea about what that message is, which niche, so what is your contribution to which particular niche literature, and what is your particular message? As long as you don't have that, don't think about the book, I would almost say. Wait until you have developed that kind of idea, right? I mean, just sitting behind the computer and say, okay, now I'm starting to write a book, or an article for that matter, it never works, right? It starts in your head. So you already need to have an idea. These are the relevant literatures. This is where I come in. I've discussed it, that idea, either through a paper, part of the idea, with presented it. I get good feedback from colleagues through that. And only then start really thinking seriously about actually writing the book. That's more from my personal experience.
I would just add a little bit to what Nicole has said about the fact that doing a PhD is a good time to actually write a monograph. And it also depends on which country you're in. And in some countries, I would say probably still the German-speaking countries, but I hesitate sort of generalizing. In some countries, it's still a certain expectation in certain subsections of the discipline that you at least should write one book in your life. And then it's probably easier to do this when you do the PhD. And then it's also not mutually exclusive. You know, if you do this well, you can do one or two sort of chapters or sections of chapters first as a journal article, and then usually it's not impossible to get permission to get this republished or reused. You know, so this is also a good strategy. So you catch two birds with a stone. You end up with a book and you do one or two journal articles ahead of time. So that would be for those who are sort of at the PhD stage, a recommendation.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt you, but actually that was one of the points I wanted to message today. If you're thinking about turning your PhD, which is then a monograph, into a book, one of the first questions we ask at Palgrave, at Comparative Territorial Politics book series, once we learn this is a proposal based on my PhD thesis, how is it different? How did you adjust, or will you adjust your PhD chapter so it will be a full standing book? And then depending on, you know, what kind of dissertation it is in the different traditions of the different countries, then more specific advice on what needs to change, in often downsizing the methodological chapters and stuff like that. Just
no, that's a very good point. Just to follow up on your follow up now. If you have a PhD manuscript, you usually start with a long theoretical discussion and methodology section, etc. And publishers are, especially in the English-speaking world, they tend to be skeptical about something that used to be a PhD manuscript. So it may even be a good strategy to not advertise it terribly strongly that this used to be a PhD. You know, just call it a book. Hide the fact that it used to be a PhD and sort of turn it more into a readable book.
Yeah, I would definitely endorse that. And how do you hide it? Well, you give it a different title for one thing. That sounds. The other thing is generally, I mean, as an editor versus as a supervisor, I would say the difference between the dissertation and the book manuscript is that doctoral students feel defensive. They're worried. I mean, if I'm your supervisor, you feel worried about me. If I'm your editor, you need to sell me on why this is a great idea, but you've already got your PhD. You're Dr. So-and-so, so you're an expert. So once you have passed that PhD stage, you need to wear that expertise and think about, I do not need to have a lit review that covers everything that ever was. No one is going to say, but why did you not cite Scarrow 19, whenever? You know, that's a different mindset a bit, I think, about what goes into going between the doctorate, where again, you know, you have this viva, and you might be, someone's going to get up and raise their hand and ask an embarrassing question. When you're got this manuscript, again, the question is, why would anyone read it? Not what are they going to attack you on? And so it's a different project that you're trying to, you may start out with an anecdote that you wouldn't have dared to put in as the introduction to the dissertation. So you may problematize it more in terms of current events. So it's becoming more trying to have an audience of 200 instead of an audience of 3. I mean, okay, you can be more ambitious, but 2,000, yeah. So that's one thing. The second, this question that you both raised, how do you do it? How do you find the time for it? I'm a little bit going to disagree with this idea of don't start it till you know what it's about, because personally, I have to write in order to think. And so for me, the way to write a book is to say, I'm going to write a book. And then I say, this is my writing time. And for me, as someone who's been a department head for 7 years, I'm now an associate dean, the writing time comes early in the day, usually before I do my run. I get this done, and then I go in and I'm working for other people. I'm running a department, I'm running a college. But for me, it's getting that 1 or 2 hours in every day, and then somehow the book comes. People are different, but I think if you're going to write the book, you commit to it. You don't just wait for brilliance to strike, but you find the time. And it does, just like your PhD, it happens over a while, but you'll get there.
Maybe you're touching upon the issue of how to write. I mean, what Susan stressed a lot, I think we all operate a bit differently. And I guess once one reaches the postdoc stage, one has a sense on how one makes best progress. And I think to some extent, I agree with Arjan that there needs to be this, one needs to have some basic motivation. It might be a particular idea that is more or less brilliant, or at least it must be an idea you think you need the book format as a format. In so far, I agree with Arjan. I wouldn't recommend anyone writing a book saying, oh, my CV would look nicer with a book. And maybe that's also the case in the academic system they are in. But in a way, the way they work, that's also linked to methodology partially, whether the article format suffices or not, doesn't lend itself to it. So I do think there must be some motivation, either a particular idea or maybe saying dealing with a phenomenon and having basically explored aspects of it, and thinking a book allows me to basically link them up systematically. So that I think is a very important part of that process. One thing I always do still today, because once one gets caught up in something, one gets convinced about, oh, this is really a good idea, because one is so close to the subject matter, one doesn't see the trees of all the wood anymore. So usually and that's maybe also going to your point, who is your reader, supervisor versus a broader audience. I usually give it not to someone who's working exactly on the thing I want to write on. I give it to someone who, if anything, tells me if it's on parties, who cares, I'm doing Europeanization or whatever, and then I give them the pitch and say, so do you get it, and do you think this could interest somebody? And I think that is usually if it's experienced people who might also have experience with writing books, even though they don't know the subject matter and do not know whether you in that short proposal have ignored half of the literature, what they have a sense for is, could that draw in wider audiences than exactly the 3 people you talk with about your work all the time. So I think in a way, that would be a very practical piece of advice. And I also agree. I think of course, as a PhD supervisor, I will be asked by my own students, do you think that makes a book? And I have, of course, an opinion on that. But as such, I'm not the best person to judge these particular projects, because I was in the process involved to advise on how to be able to defend all the choices made in a way that it sort of cannot be shot down by some assessor later on. And that is a very different mindset from someone who said, maybe I could conceivably read something about that topic and would pick up a book, and would I be drawn in by this basic idea? So that in a way, I think and it is something I still, and I have written books, it is still something I do today, because I think at some point, especially if one thinks, I have now a consolidated knowledge about that topic and I have something to say, you lose the distance to the arguments you yourself think are A, perfectly clear, but B, also interesting to other people. I think no matter how experienced people get, an outside perspective is always, by somebody experienced, is always a very important part of the process. And I have my people, if they say, okay, run with it. And then I think, okay, now I can maybe discuss the matter with a more specialist audience before I go ahead. And I think being proactive, asking that advice, also maybe people you are not closely working with. I think that, of course, one has also an inhibition to share work and think, what do they think about that? But I think this outside perspective is absolutely crucial to make that decision. Do I now push on with that and make also the sacrifices, and also not being able to do things maybe one would otherwise like to be doing in terms of smaller projects. There's one thing I have no experience in, but I have been thinking what would be things I want to raise. And one reason for books is, of course, what is quite neat, because there is a lot of hype, of course, in comparative politics about mixed methods, which is excessively difficult to do well in 8 or even 10 or 12,000 words. So I was thinking, well, that's actually something a book format can give you, that you have the space to develop the different elements and integrate them nicely. But also, of course, you could bring together teams of people who are absolutely specialized on each element to create a product that is even better than whatever some single person could do. So I was wondering about, I know you have single authored, I don't know whether you have co-authored, but I was wondering whether people have any input on how that process works, because personally, I have never gone through it, but thinking about it, how to, I intuitively, I think, to make a book project manageable, if you have a group of people passionate about the same topic, wouldn't that be the format to go to produce something more than you can do by yourself?
Not for this audience. Well, so we've got people here who haven't published their first one. And I think what Thomas said, one of the big wins is this is a project you've done by yourself. And whereas there is a lot of social science now that's in teams, and so there will be more books written by teams. But if what you have in your drawer or electronic drawer is a manuscript that's by just you, that's a great thing. And that is a great to develop it more. So I do agree that the long-term project is the book. But I think so many of you have a great opportunity to publish something that's going to be your brand and just you. So I would say for the moment, until you're the professor who has your own postdoc and has your own team, then you do it. But right now you need to be, if you're at the career stage where you should, if you're going to write a book, it should be partly to capitalize on, this is the chance for you to give your statement, not as a co-author, but as an author. So I think that would be one of my ways of answering that question. But I think it's a great idea for the long term.
Yeah, but how do you know whether you have that statement to make? You can have that idea. Okay, I think I have a contribution. But how can you test whether you actually have what you think you have, right? But there are ways around that, right? So, for example, you can think about, well, is this, I think, what I have to tell, or my book idea, is for this kind of readership and this kind of book series. Go to the series editor, email, during a conference like this. Hey, I have this idea. Do you think that it would be something like that? Ask your colleagues. Another thing is, and it's often also in book proposals forums, you know, this kind of question, what are the main competitor books? Nasty question, eh? But actually, it helps. Okay, these are books that touch upon or are related to what I'm doing. Yeah, actually, what do I have to tell to them? What do I do in addition to them? So there's another way to test whether, well, is my contribution a real contribution there? And can I, you know, sell that?
Also published.
Yeah, yeah, where they published? Yeah. What kind of literatures do they cite? And so forth. At the third one. So another way is, yeah, try to push yourself in my contribution is, or the book's contribution is threefold or fourfold or how many, or twofold. But really, you know, that you're really able to put it down in a nutshell, right? And then after you have done the nutshell, then the elaboration can come, right? This is so because, etc. And that helps them with the writing, but also with talking to people. This is my idea, and this is what I think is the contribution.
Yeah, if they wake you up in the middle of the night and ask you what is a book about, you know, you should have a clear answer. But shall we move over to the more technical side of things now? I've written down a few things because you already moved towards the question, how do I get a publisher? You know, what does a book proposal look like? First of all, there are series editors out there who you can talk to, and the conference is the location or the venue to talk to them informally and get an idea whether they might be interested. Secondly, I've also watched, and of course, those who are present are excluded from this, but I've watched some of my colleagues waiting for long for responses. So if you have decided that you want to go into a certain series, which can be a good advantage because it increases the visibility and you know, it puts you into a certain segment of the readership. Don't be too shy actually contacting series editors because, you know, you're doing many things at the same time, and sometimes, you know, editorships change and things get lost and so on. Don't wait for half a year, you know. Don't write every week, you know, but try to find a reasonable middle ground, because I've watched twice in Düsseldorf people waiting very long for responses, you know. And as I said, nobody, all who are present here are of course excluded. So that's one advice. And then of course, invest a lot of time in trying to find out, and websites of publishers are not always so clear, what do they want from you? You know, what kind of book proposal? Do they want to see the full manuscript? Do they want to have a prospectus? Quite often they want a prospectus. And then, of course, you need to answer these questions like, what is it good for? What is the market? Make sure you know whether they want to see a sample chapter or whether they will eventually want to see the entire manuscript. As I said, this varies. Also, it varies as regards to the kind of review they will put you through, you know, and whether they want to review the entire book eventually, or whether they give you a contract on the basis of a prospectus. Publishers do very different things here. Some publishers also do a relatively strict clearance read at the end, so they send it out again for a kind of review, and the reviewer then says, okay, this kind of conforms to the quality standards of the publishers. That's all something you should be clear about when you start approaching a publisher. Make sure that you send them what they want and expect from you. And then this almost goes without saying, you know, don't try several at the time unless they are explicit about it, that they might want to review, they might be prepared to look at a short prospectus. But once a manuscript is under review, they will not like you to approach a second publisher. This is a real no-no. That's as much as I've written down at the moment, but I'm sure Susan knows other things.
Yeah, let me jump in there with a couple of things. First, what is a series editor? Just to be clear about that. So most publishers, not all of them, but many of them, like at Oxford or Cambridge, they'll publish a lot of books. They'll also have some sub-series if you look at their catalog. And the sub-series in comparative political economy, international relations, whatever, the sub-series or the series editor is often a member of an academic who's like Nicole or I previously or Thomas. We're doing that on the side. It's not a job. It's really not a paid job, but it's our job to go out and be talent scouts. That's what I'd say. That why is the publisher employing members of the profession to go look at this? That means we're sort of intermediaries, and we can give advice, and we can be cheerleaders. We like this book. We might try to help you get your proposal better, but the decider sits in Oxford or wherever. It's not going to be us. So that's good. So approaching us, we can give you frank advice, and it's not the last word. So that's a good reason to go through a series editor, because they can advocate for you and can help you get things in the right shape. So that's one reason. You don't have to go through a series editor, but especially with the first manuscript, when you're not known to the editor already, that can be a really good way to get your foot in the door, which is what you're trying to do. So that's forget what my other points are, but I'm sure we'll come back to them.
We talk a little bit about having moved topic on what do publishers expect. I mean, one thing maybe to add to Thomas's point, you should of course do your research well, but of course, at least that's the case with the OUP series. It's not that we have a process that we expect that is set in stone, in the sense of that anyone who wants a contract in the series needs a proposal plus chapters or the full manuscript. It, of course, also will depend on the career stage. So if you have somebody who has already a lot of experience writing monographs, you might say, seeing the proposal plus sample chapters, while the tendency is, if either it's obvious or not so obvious that this is a PhD based one, it's a relatively junior scholar, then usually the tendency will be that one wants to see the full manuscripts. But I fully agree with Thomas that it's important to check this out, because I have published with OUP, and usually once you had the contract, you write the book, you send it in, it's done. And last time around, and I'm a series editor, I get the email back by the editor, Dominic, saying, oh, thanks a lot for this. Now this goes out for review again. I'm lost. So I went through another full round of improving. I mean, it made to be honest, it's good they did it, because it made the manuscript much better in the end. But I was sort of thrown, because I was, after 7 years, finally it is gone. And then, well, it wasn't quite. So it's just to stress to figure that out clearly. In advance. And I think that is why approaching the editor, especially if the standards also vary or might change over time, the series editors, because we are not vetoing anything in the end. We can only give open advice, and I think we do that in the nicest possible way, to say this is ready. Yeah, let's approach the OUP editor with this prospectus right away, or saying, well, one can sort of, even though you don't say it, see this is a thesis, and that will sort of not trigger the response by the actual OUP editor that you would want. So it's better to do A, B, and C with the material that you gave us. So just to echo that again.
So let me also follow up on that. So what if you turn in this prospectus and it comes back like, brilliant, we want to see the whole manuscript? What do you do then? I mean, you don't want to approach the press too early and say, oh, well, I was going to spend the next 2 years rewriting it. So you need to think about the timing, and what happens if you get an immediate and positive response. Do you have 3 sample chapters ready to go, so you could at least, it looks almost done, even if you haven't completely rewritten it, you can at least sound like, well, I've got a lot of it done. Do you want to see that now, or do you want to wait 6 months until I have it rewritten? I don't think for a first book you're likely to get a full contract just on a prospectus. So you can talk, you can look at series, you can get some idea of what topics are they publishing on, who's looking likely. But you also have to think about, you know, it could take a long time, but we've worked with Oxford and the editor, he'll give you an answer in 20 minutes. Sometimes the answer is no, and we'll wait a few days to get back to the author because it sort of looks rude to say, oh, no. So you know, you'll get an immediate answer, but you can also get an immediate yes. I'll send it out to the reviewers now if they have it ready. And then you go back to the author and the author says, well, I actually don't have a manuscript ready. We'll take it in 2 years, probably, but there's the energy has gone out of the room. So you do need to think about the other side. What if someone's really enthusiastic? Are you ready to go?
Maybe take a question. Yeah. So basically, I mean, maybe one follow-up question to the panel. I mean, we have a little bit talked about that the OUP process it depends also a bit on career stage. But I think one thing to stress is, especially as you might get a positive or negative response to the proposal, that this is, of course, the kind of, you should take a lot of care with a proposal, because I think now getting proposals sent, one can, in a way, one sees skimming over it. Is that somebody who got some advice by someone knowing how to write this? Or is that somebody who sort of thought, oh, I have that thesis and I want to do something with it? And it is actually, that is the thing you use to attract interest. So to really get that proposal right and maybe not send it too early with a vague idea. Sometimes someone gets email, oh, I have this book on this topic. Is that of any interest to the series? And one can always say, yeah, oh, that seems like a good fit. But it always will be then, and we want to see the proposal at the very least before we really say anything more specific. So I think that is just something important to stress. But I think we have two different presses that I also don't know a lot about. Are there any particular aspects when ECPR press commissions something that you want to stress? That are the requirements, or for Palgrave specifically, you might want to add to just add a few very concrete aspects, and then we can open up for any questions the audience might have.
Well, I cannot say anything about ECPR press now, because when I did the ECPR comparative politics book series or whatever studies in comparative politics, it was still with Routledge, so I have a lot more experience with Routledge, but that gives me the chance to say a little bit about, a little bit in defense of edited volumes. You know, edited volumes, they have gone through several ups and downs. You know, some of the great classics in the field of comparative politics, like Stein-Rockhan and others, that's edited volumes. And then there were also times when OUP would tell us, don't even go there. You know, now I've just published the 3rd edited volume with OUP. So they do change their mind. And that brings me back to this point about open access, because that changes the playing field, you know, and there are good reasons for, you know, later in the career, it's not the first thing you do, to do edited volumes, because sometimes it makes sense to have actually a theory and a number of case studies. And especially since publishers are using increasingly, you know, almost overwhelmingly have moved towards electronic publishing and also increasingly towards open access, their logic changes. You know, the last thing I did, I was really surprised to get 25 country chapters in. You know, a few years ago, they would have said to me, go away, forget it, you know, bury it. You know, we're not going to print 150 or 200, 400 pages because it was too costly. If you do it electronically, their logic changes. So that was one remark. So if for you, for example, you come out of a ECPR joint workshop at the joint session, so even if you have a section here at the general conference, and there's a sufficient number of papers which speak together, you know, then you can also think about doing an edited volume, and there is a place for that. Especially because special issues, which is always, you know, special issues in journals, which is always plan B, they're hard to get, and also they only give you 5 or 6 chapters at the end, or 5 or 6 contributions. Edited volumes that were, you know, with Routledge, they're typically done on a prospectus plus some sample chapters, and the sample chapters go out to review, but they don't want to see the entire book normally. But I keep saying normally because your example just shows us that there's no you never know what they're doing. There's a bit of unpredictability, and they also change their policies. You need to know this. And you shouldn't be too hesitant to ask the editors. That's where, you know, the in-house editors and the publishers, that's where they are for and why they are there. So what we used to do normally for the ECPR book series was like the theory chapter and 2 or 3 sample chapters. For an edited volume, it's usually quite important to also think hard about a concluding chapter, because even if the concluding chapter is short, it tends to be a bit shorter. You know, there should be some purpose that you can sum up in the end of at the end of the book, because it's more than just a number of individual contributions between two covers, right? That's as much as I would like to say. Over to you.
Yeah, at Palgrave, there tends to be a similar kind of procedure, prospectus plus some sample chapters. And then indeed, either introduction or conclusion that really brings out the contribution and the approach and the literature, etc., of the whole book. But then subsequently, we have a clearance read when the full manuscript has been submitted. So, yeah, maybe marginal check is a bit too loose of a term, but, you know, a reviewer, at least one reviewer going through the whole book manuscript text. In addition to the eventuality, great, now deliver the whole manuscript, you can also have the eventuality, great, but this needs to go, that needs to be added, please do this, don't forget that literature, and so forth. What are you going to do, right? This counts also a bit with, you know, the review process with articles, right? And do you do the changes just because the reviewer wants to do it? Or do you want to stick, right, a bit? No, I draw a line here, and this is why, you know, I don't follow up particular reasons. Now, the reason why I mention this is that I think for a book, it's a bit different than for an article, to the extent that the book is more of, yeah, in my perception at least, in the way how I feel await colleagues and their work is, you know, if someone has published a good book, right, that impresses me, right? Also a number of good articles, of course, but, you know, a book as well. So, you know, whereas, you know, an article where you actually had the feeling, okay, I gave in a bit too much to the reviewer, we all, most of us will do it, but it hurts more for a book. I don't know, yeah, I don't know, it's but. So it's more important to stick to, you know, no, it's my book, right? It's my piece of work. So, yeah, I'm not going to change this or that, or this is what I want to do. We should always be open for good arguments. I mean, that's, yeah, absolutely.
Can I just add something on the clearance read? And, you know, there are different procedures. When I did the ECPR book series, I was kind of the clearance reader. They had outsourced it to me, which was a lot of work. So the manuscript would come first to me, and then I would look whether the team of authors had done what they had promised to do, and whether there was a concluding chapter and so on. I didn't read it word by word, but I went through the manuscript, you know, and sometimes that's why I said you need to be clear what is going to happen, and you better check in advance, but they may not always tell you, as we've just learned, what the procedure is. But you always need to keep in mind that the manuscript that you will submit will be looked at more or less carefully, you know, either by an external reviewer or by a series editor. That depends, you know, sometimes, but you know, if the in-house editor thinks,
still ask for changes.
Yeah. I mean, if you have done 5 monographs of OUP, they will probably not do this anymore, but few of us do 5. Okay.
Well, you can get a lot of feedback, especially if it's sent out to external reviewers who then read the thing on its own merit. So, and as I say, I think it is a good thing to have that final process, especially since that again provides the outside perspective of somebody who's not entangled in the project to look at it, whether the final project or product sort of properly works as a round sort of contribution to the field. I think we have I think we have talked a lot. What will happen now is that we would like to open up to questions. I will run around the room because we are recorded and you will not be heard on the recording if I not get to you with a microphone. So who wants to go first? Maybe I could take people from one corner or close to me first.
Thank you so much for the presentation. It's very helpful. I just finished my PhD this year. Thank you. And I started my postdoc. So I'm pretty much in the the stage that this kind of presentations are really helpful. And I think this thing you slightly touch it is it's about because I made field work like a lot 4 years, so I have a lot of empirical material for my dissertation. And the situation is, as a young scholar, is I need to publish because I need a job, obviously, but at the same time I want to make this long-term statement, right? So what is the or what do you think about a balance between just try to publish your material in journals and how to save some of this material in order to make a book. So yeah, because I imagine you cannot exhaust your material just sending it out to journals, but at the same time you need to publish. So you're in this kind of critical moment that you want to save it, but at the same time you need to publish. So how do you feel about it? Is there any advice on it?
Well, first of all, it depends what system you're in. I mean, again, we come back to that, like how quickly do you need to publish, and what are the rewards of that book? So that you need to think about that. But yeah, my advice in the American system, when I was a department chair advising people, was definitely if they didn't have the book contract really quickly, then they needed to be focusing on articles, because for us, there's this 10-year deadline, and it was what you got out and published within the first 5 years. So there was a very rigid deadline. And so you could sort of work your way back that if you didn't have the contract yet, the book wasn't going to be out by this date. So that was better to focus on the article strategy. And of course, also for us, the question comes up, what have you done since your dissertation? So there is an incentive to be getting to work on the new journal articles and the new projects. It's not either or. So sometimes you get more reward even if you're a little slow on getting the first project published as a book, but you've gotten 1 or 2 articles out of it. But then you're already at work. You've put in the grant application for the next project, which then turns into the article, so that it shows that you're more than your dissertation. You do want to get your dissertation out. You do want to get that research to get the recognition it deserves. But it doesn't always have to be the first thing that comes out, because your next things may be important too.
I have nothing to add, really. That's what I would have said.
Yeah, just underlining that rather than seeing it as a kind of dilemma, choosing between 2 paths in a way, try to see it as a kind of, how can I make it a synergy? Right, so I continue my line of research. I explore, for example, you have a key independent variable. I explore more impacts of my key independent variable, or if you have a key dependent variable, what else can impact my dependent variable? And then also think longer term, what then could a book do? And there's nothing against reusing material of your articles into the book. Of course, you will be confronted with the book, what is added value, right? And that added value should not just be, I have added 5 cases in a quantitative analysis of 20. It needs to be a bit more than that. But it's not that difficult often, right? So rather see articles and book all part of a kind of broader development of building up your own research expertise in your own particular niche, right? So rather try to find a kind of synergy there. Okay. So in the coming 2-3 years through my postdoc, these are my paper projects. And then in the longer 5-year term, all these papers build up to something around this.
just to add to that, I think especially for junior scholars who want to get a contract for their first book, at least as I see it from the OUP perspective, is that if a younger scholar has actually published, let's say we just got somebody under contract, first book, postdoc, relatively early in the career, having published one piece in a top American journal, and that's also some overlap to the book. If anything, that already signals to us this has already undergone quite demanding scrutiny, so this person really can do good research. Obviously, then it cannot be, the book cannot read like a kind of addition of different quantitative, let's say, analysis that are sort of loosely tied. But I do not think as such, and so I underline what Ayan said, that overlap is possible. I think the only thing you should keep in mind is that you can do it first few articles and then make a broader book out of it. It doesn't work, I don't think, the other way around, because journal editors don't basically publish articles that are based on a book that is already out. So I think the one major strategic decision you should make is, how can I sequence that? But as I say, if anything, the younger the author is, the more it is sort of a signal for us, oh, that's somebody who can get through a tough review. And so it's something good if the overlap is not excessive, let's say, that one cannot quite see why would anybody pick up a book having read these 3 articles already. So that, again, that is something you need to maneuver, but I wouldn't be too worried about it, because if you have spent 4 years on a topic, I'm sure there is so much material, probably more than you will be able to sort of do justice to, even combining articles and the book. So it's just like thinking about the sequencing and how to get that process managed, let's say. Any other question?
Thanks. So I'm going to be cheeky and ask 2 questions, if that's okay, but they're sort of linked together. So first, you said sort of kind of introduce some of the dangers, I suppose, of like PhD and editors looking at a PhD and kind of looking at it differently to a book that's emerged out of, you know, a sort of different research project. Is there anything that you in a review, in a book proposal, obviously signals it's a PhD, and things that you should obviously try to avoid, like language, structure, things like that? And the second thing was, could you expand a bit more on how the review process works? So is it very similar to journals, or a bit more relaxed or stringent, or yeah, thanks.
Well, first of all, first question, I would always call it a book, not a PhD manuscript. You know, I would first, I would either try to hide it, but then I need to make some qualifications, because German, it's different. For example, because there's also an obligation in some countries. There's this, as you know, the obligation to publish your PhD, and otherwise you will not get the title. It's part of the process, the required process. So that changes the playing field considerably. But in the English-speaking world, I would not advertise the fact that this was I wouldn't call it a PhD manuscript. I would call it a book, probably a book based on my previous PhD. You know, a book manuscript. I would call it a book manuscript. And you should probably take out some of the things that one typically does in a PhD, is a long method section, some meta theory that nobody wants to read. At least supervisors want to read it, but not the normal audience, you know. So that is damaging. I speak from experience, you know. So I would, and as regards the review process, it is basically the same. They tend to send it to 2 or 3 readers, usually 2, because, you know, reading an entire manuscript is onerous. The reviewers get slightly different questions. I mean, of course, it's first and foremost, especially with good university presses or good professional publishers, is the academic value. But they will also ask the reviewers, do you think that this, you know, what's the audience? You know, can this be used for postgraduate teaching? Is you know, the competition, the audience, all these things you should, as we said before, you should address in your book proposal. And they will look at that, and that's part of the review process. But generally, you know, it's a different kind of creature than a journal article, but it's a proper academic review, and you get a few pages back from each of them. And then it depends on the procedure, whether there's a series editor or the in-house editor is your direct point of access, and they will also make a judgment. You know, it's probably a little bit less formalized than, I would say it's less formalized than with journals, where nowadays the good journals, they will tell you if there's one not absolutely positive review, you're out anyway. You know, book editor, series editors, book editors have a little bit more flexibility there. Anything to add? Okay.
I mean, if I can add, I think there has been years back somehow circulating basically advice to younger scholars, oh, OUP doesn't do dissertations, which I think I would say is not the case. It's not the case. And obviously what comes with the manuscript or the submission is, of course, your CV. And if you write on, let's say, courts is the manuscript, and then you have a PhD on courts and being supervised by leading experts in that field, I think even if you do not call it a dissertation, it's obvious it will be drawing on that research. But I fully agree, you shouldn't sort of stress it a lot. But at the same time, I think the more critical thing that Susan mentioned at the beginning is that if you see that somebody relatively young and you essentially know it's a PhD research, and then you start reading the proposal and then it reads like a PhD because it's very defensive. And I think that could put editors off relatively quickly, because one sort of then if the proposal is written like that, you expect the manuscript to be rather like a PhD in that style, and that is just not a good sell. So I would rather think about the kind of style in presenting the argument that, as I say, is not about basically defending yourself against any methodological criticism on the planet when you are at that stage, that you are hopefully through with at that stage, but to think about making sure that you really try to confidently tell any reader, why is this exciting? Why do I contribute to, how do I contribute significantly to the state of the arts? So I think that is something. So as I say, if anything, I think now knowing academic practice, the idea that somebody had actually several years' time to focus on a topic is in principle a good thing. The problem is how it is presented, that sometimes is a downside. And I think this is why at certain times there was this, oh no, dissertations are a no-go, but it has to do with the way then the material is written. Not that obviously if you write a really good PhD, the research is excellent or less excellent than by somebody who's already 10 years in the business.
That's just one point. It's an obvious one, but I just wanted to make it because I have come across this several times. When you write your book proposal, don't try to tell the editors that you've completely reinvented the wheel, you know, that everybody else was wrong and what you're doing is right, because you need to also anticipate who are going to be the reviewers. That sounds very trivial, but I've seen several of these posts, you know. Don't try to alienate. Better say, I build on this, you know, or I add something to this, rather than say, you know, I think what I'm doing is right and everybody else so far was wrong. I mean, there's, of course, very much a PhD frame of mind to a certain degree, but try to get away from this.
Thank you so much for organizing this panel. This has been very helpful. And I'm only asking this question. I know we have talked a little bit about dissertations and probably some people in the room are going to be tired of it, but just because you've mentioned it, I'm coming out of the German system. I have to write a monography. I have to publish it probably within a year. I just wondered if you have experiences with that specific situation you maybe can add on to what has already been said. Thank you.
First question is, what language is your PhD? English. Well, then I would advise you, well, I mean, we can also have a private conversation later if we are probably a small minority, but one good option is always Springer now, because they do this relatively fast, and it's a completely different story because they want to see the reports from the PhD. You know, and they basically have a scheme. These things keep changing also, but they have a scheme. If you get at least a Magna, then they will more or less take it, you know. And then, of course, in the German system, there's the real question whether they want a publishing fee or not. At the moment, they are in this game that they don't ask you for publishing fees. A few years back, it was different. But Springer can be a good option because they're very accessible. They have a very aggressive open access policy. Or, so that's a bit of a trade-off. Since it's in English, you know, you can go to the Anglo-Saxon market, which gives you a better audience, or it's more status, you know, but it will take 2 years longer probably. So that's a bit of a trade-off.
All right, thank you so much for sharing your inside views with us. I have also a question as it comes to those critiques coming from specialized authors that comes usually in the back cover of books, and as it comes as well to the promotion of the books afterwards. Is this something that would come from the authors, or is it encouraged by the publishers? Is this a joint effort? And would that be some type of planning that would also make sense to include in the book proposal?
So my experience is, well, don't worry about that. Your publisher will, if the book is accepted, they have their own communication people and their own publicity people. So they'll decide. Never buy a book based on those recommendations. I'll say as someone who has written many of them, sometimes I've read the books that I'm asked for to endorse, but often I'm asked by a communications person, could you send us a blurb for your good friend Thomas Poguntke? We need it in 2 days. Would you like us to send you the manuscript first before you endorse it? And then I get a link to his 450-page book, and I'm supposed and then I'm supposed to say, brilliant, this will change the whole discipline. So there's a question. So the blurbs are, and then there's the question about who picks up a book anyway and reads the back cover. I guess it goes on the webpage now, but so those are things that it's sort of an old-fashioned practice that the publishers are continuing. I wouldn't worry about that they will help you promote the book. They may also ask you perhaps more seriously and more helpfully to write a blog somewhere to ask you how you can self-promote it, and which you will be hopefully doing ahead of time by taking chapters to conferences like this. I mean, that's how do you promote, who is your biggest readership? It is going to be your colleagues in the discipline, even for these books that we're saying try to write for a bigger audience, but it's not a huge audience usually for your first book. It's an academic audience. And the best way is to network with people. And so who's going to cite it? They're going to cite it because they saw you present something. So that's actually the best kind of publicity, is the citations that other people are doing, perhaps of that article you've written that comes ahead of the book.
I would very much like to underline how much self-selection is going on here. Because in my experience, you know, I can just give them the endorsements, or in communication with them, hey, is it okay if I contact some colleagues with to get some endorsements? And then I place them on the back of the book, together with a short summary of the book. And yes, there's a lot of self-selection, and probably, right, your colleague whom you've asked to give an endorsement has not read the whole book, but this person knows your research. This person probably also knows, just by browsing through the book, oh, that's nice, this and this and this is added to the literature. So these endorsements do give a kind of, provide information about the main contributions of the book. So yes, there's always positive, because of course you're not going to put the negative endorsements there, thereof, but they are helpful in signaling the main contributions of your book, and you can steer it you can ask your former supervisor, some colleagues you know, and so forth, and be a bit, yeah, you can be proactive there.
I have a question similarly towards like the post-production process. What are things that we might not think are negotiable that are negotiable? Such as like who writes the index or the royalties, maybe like secrets from being in the business for a while.
Don't plan on getting rich on royalties. you will be lucky to get anything. And what you will get out of a book is your career. I mean, it will pay you if you're in an academic career and there are incentives. It may be worth a lot to you, but it's not going to be the royalties. So that's the one thing. Sometimes there's a question of who pays for the index, but who pays for the index could be your institution, or could be the grant you're on, or there are grants to do the indexing now. So but it's a good question to ask when you're signing the contract, who's responsible for the index? Software's made it a lot cheaper. So it's maybe €1,000, maybe less. Now you can find someone who's going to do it for you. I don't know what the market is, but it's a lot cheaper than it used to be to go through there. Pretty soon AI can do it for you for free, probably. So it's going to be not a huge cost, but it's worth asking that. What else can you negotiate? Again, with digital's made it a lot easier of, could you put in photos? How many images can you put in? Used to be something that cost them a lot, and therefore you had to negotiate. Like page length cost them a lot. Well, if they're not printing it on paper, and many presses are not spending much time copy editing anymore, which is why when you read a book, you find a lot of errors. So they're not doing that anymore. It doesn't cost them anything. You send them a file that they basically put online with more or less gatekeeping going on. So some of the things that used to cost, I mean, the good side is you don't have to worry. So there's fewer things to negotiate because there are fewer things to say no. But if you get to the stage of a contract, you should definitely, to the extent these things matter, like photos, find out who's paying.
If I may, yeah. I think you're asking a question a little bit in the wrong way. You should ask what I find important. I cannot underline strongly enough, you want to be read, right? So what is very important for you? There's a way for you to make the book publicly, freely available, whether it's open access or that you really allowed to the preprint making available and not the final version. That's important to you. Now, okay, it's very nice when, you either get through your institution or through the publisher, someone who makes the index for you. But you want to have a good index for your book, that your readers really, that the index is attuned to your readership. That's important. So even if you can outsource it, be in control and check the work, right? So that's important. So try to really think, yeah, from that perspective.
One or two minor points to add. Something their publishers are always relatively flexible is, a few more complementary copies, which saves you a lot of money because the printed copies are the ones that cost. Other point, in the editorial process, I mean, we're all reasonably fluent in English, but it does help probably if you have access to a specialized language editing service. We've used this in my institute sometimes. Some of them are better, some of them are worse, but they also save you some time because they check the bibliography, etc. It's a question of money, but it's worth thinking about this. Third point, open access fees. I mean, if you are in an institution or if you can factor this into a research into a grant proposal or whatever, because they charge you something, and if you're lucky enough and you're in an institution where they cover some of that, that's very helpful because open access really makes a huge difference, as we know from journal articles, by the cost.
Just to add two small points, that's now my personal opinions. Do the index yourself. I got it done once and looked at it later and was not happy with it. I think if you want to have a good index, that if people pick up the book and they are interested in an element, of course, you have the analytical sort of overview of the manuscript, and you can actually produce one that is really helpful to readers. So in that sense, I would rather say, if you have the time at all, even if they would do it for you, I personally wouldn't go for it anymore, because I spent years on that book, and then I want that bit to be of standard as well. And if it's done by somebody who has no clue about the subject matter, then that will feed into the quality. And I also think I want to underline what Thomas said about language editing. Some publishers do it with OUP, you get one, but it's relatively light. So if you have your hands on a native speaker who is committed to really work himself through it or herself through it, ideally someone who's maybe not too close on the subject matter, you should use it. I have my stuff read by my husband, who's a historian, has no interest whatsoever in what I'm doing, but he's English and quite pedantic on language, so I benefit from that. So that, because it will just, also again, you want to be read, and you want to have the experience of the reader, that they go through it and think, oh, this is really nicely coming together, not what on earth does she mean here? Is that really English? Or because there is a difference necessarily, even if you operate in an English-speaking environment for decades, in terms of how you write. And at some point, you cannot even fix anymore what doesn't sound English, because there is just so much you can do. So just to underline, that's very important.
Can I just add half a sentence? Don't trust copy editors. Even with big publishers, I could later on tell you the anecdotes, they turn around things because they may not be from your specific subfield, and they do things that you read it yourself at the end.
Thank you all for the interesting discussion. I think my question is not directly related to the publication process, and it's also more about publishing a second book. So I'm a postdoc now, and I'm thinking about writing grant applications and things like that. And what I'm debating a bit is about including a book as one of the outcomes of a specific project that I'm writing a grant proposal for. And some people have advised me to do that, and some people say don't do it. And the reason is you don't have the book contract yet, of course, if you write this grant proposal, right? You're just including kind of deliverables. Would you advise including a book in such a grant proposal with the risk that you still need to secure a book contract for your project after you've done all the research? Or do you think that it's not smart to promise something like this because it's very difficult to get a book contract with a good publisher on your project? So it's not directly related to publishing, but I was wondering if you could say something about it. Thank you.
I guess I'll say this as someone who served on a lot of grant review committees. So first, I never believe what people say their deliverables are. I mean, it's usually I'm going to write 10 articles and a book with OUP. Fine, that's good. That tells me your ambition. That tells me what you want to do with it. Whether you're actually going to do all of that, doesn't matter to me, but it tells me something about the types of projects you're looking to do. So it does signal, I think this has a coherent thing. In terms of the plausibility, it goes back to what Nicole says. If you say I'm going to publish in the top 3 journals, and you've never published in the top 3 journals, I'll be more skeptical than if you've already published there. And again, if you say I'm going to publish a book because you've already published a book, then you'll have more of a track record that you can do the long form scholarship. But I think it goes back to, does it make sense for the project that the best way, the type of data you're collecting is going to be best explained in the long form, or is it going to be best shared in journal article? And that's probably more important to the reviewers is the project itself, but it gives some signal about how do you see your outputs contributing or the narrative. And let me just get back. Let me just say that one because we're running out of time, but just a book has a story. Let's not forget that books are stories. They're narratives. Has anyone done the 3-minute thesis competition? So 3-minute thesis is started in Australia, has spread to a lot of, it's the elevator speech as a contest, but you get 2 slides and 3 minutes to explain the whole topic of your dissertation. It's not a bad exercise to try of, if you have to hype this, then explain the so what. This is my topic and what I found and why you should care in 3 minutes. It's not a bad idea. This is what a book has to do over sustain, but you need a story.
Okay, anybody else wanting to jump in? I think a lot of advice has been given, and of course we do hope that the panel was useful for all of you, and of course we hope that you all will be writing interesting books and publishing interesting books. So thanks so much to the panel, and thanks so much for participating and engaging and turning up, of course. So thank you.